My adult children convinced me I was too old to manage my own money, so they took control of my $2.3 million portfolio. What they didn't know was that I'm a retired financial advisor who had been secretly documenting their attempts to financially abuse me. The manipulation began so subtly that I almost missed it. Almost. But when you've spent 40 years helping people protect their wealth from predators, you develop instincts that are hard to ignore, even when the predators are your own children. It started 3 months ago, during what should have been a pleasant Sunday dinner at my house in Greenwich. Rebecca, my daughter, and Jason, my son, had been visiting more frequently since Catherine's death last year, which I had initially interpreted as concern for their widowed father. The dining room felt too large without Catherine's presence, her empty chair at the head of the table a constant reminder of how much had changed. But having my children there, along with Rebecca's husband Marcus and Jason's wife Elena, filled some of the silence that had become my constant companion. The conversation had been flowing normally. Jason discussing his law practice, Rebecca updating me on her marketing consulting business, the usual family chatter that made me feel less alone in this house that had once buzzed with Catherine's energy. Then Marcus, Rebecca's husband, made a comment that should have been a warning sign. "Thomas, managing all this financial stuff by yourself must be overwhelming," Marcus said, gesturing vaguely around my dining room with its mahogany furniture and crystal chandelier, indicators of the comfortable life Catherine and I had built over 40 years of careful planning and smart investments. "Especially at your age, with everything you've been through this year." At your age. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette no one wanted to acknowledge. I was 68, not 98. My mind was as sharp as it had been when I was advising clients about portfolio diversification and estate planning. But Marcus continued, his voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're trying to sound helpful while delivering an insult. "Rebecca and I were talking, and we think it might be time to consider having someone else handle the day-to-day financial decisions. Take some pressure off you." Rebecca nodded, her blonde hair catching the light from the chandelier Catherine had picked out 15 years ago. "Dad, we're just worried about you. You've seemed forgetful lately, and managing a portfolio like yours requires constant attention." Forgetful. I'd forgotten to return a phone call the previous week because I was researching market trends for my personal investments. I'd momentarily misplaced my reading glasses the month before, finding them exactly where I'd left them on my desk in the study. These weren't signs of cognitive decline. They were the normal absent-mindedness of a man adjusting to life without his wife of 42 years. But my children were constructing a narrative of decline that fit their purposes rather than reality. "We think," Elaine added, her voice soft but insistent, "that it would be better for everyone if Jason and Rebecca took over your financial management. They understand your situation, and they want what's best for you." What's best for you? The phrase that launches 1,000 betrayals, delivered by people who've decided they know better than you do about your own life. I'd set down my fork carefully, the weight of their coordinated presentation settling over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation born from genuine concern. This was a planned intervention, carefully choreographed to make me feel incompetent and grateful for their offer to help. "I appreciate your concern," I'd said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest, "but I'm perfectly capable of managing my own finances." The look that passed between Rebecca and Jason was brief but telling. They'd expected resistance, and they were prepared for it. "Dad," Rebecca said, leaning forward with the expression she'd perfected as a child when she wanted something, "we're not questioning your capability. We're questioning whether it's fair to put all this stress on yourself." Stress. Managing the portfolio that had grown from careful investments and conservative strategies over 40 decades wasn't stress, it was purpose. It was the culmination of everything I'd learned about building and preserving wealth. It was my legacy to them, ironically enough. But they continued their campaign throughout dinner, each contributing pieces to the argument that I was becoming a burden to myself and, by extension, to them. Marcus mentioned elderly financial fraud, painting pictures of predatory advisors and scam artists who targeted vulnerable seniors. Elena talked about the complexity of modern markets, as if I hadn't been navigating those complexities since before she was born. By the time dessert was served, Catherine's favorite apple pie that I'd learned to make in the month since her death, they had presented a comprehensive case for why I should voluntarily surrender control of my financial life to them. "Think about it, Dad," Jason said, as they prepared to leave. "We can set up a system where you're still involved in major decisions, but Rebecca and I handle the daily management. It would give you peace of mind." Peace of mind. Another phrase that sounds caring but often means something else entirely. After they left, I sat in my study, surrounded by the mahogany bookshelves Catherine had insisted would make the room feel warm and intellectual. The leather-bound volumes on investment theory and market analysis seemed to mock me. All that knowledge, all that experience, apparently worthless because I'd reached an arbitrary age where my own children felt entitled to question my competence. But something about their presentation bothered me beyond the obvious condescension. The coordination was too perfect, the arguments too polished. This wasn't a family conversation that had evolved naturally from concern. This was a sales pitch. And I'd spent enough years in financial services to recognize when someone was trying to sell me something I didn't need. I opened my laptop and began doing what I'd done for 40 years when something didn't feel right. I started investigating. The first thing I discovered was that Rebecca's marketing consulting business wasn't as successful as she'd been claiming. A simple search of public records showed that her LLC had filed for a tax extension, usually a sign of cash flow problems. Her social media presence, which she managed for clients, showed expensive dinners and luxury purchases that seemed inconsistent with someone whose business was struggling. Jason's law practice told a similar story. His firm had recently lost a major client, information available in legal journals, and his wife Elena had been posting about expensive renovations to their house in Westport. Kitchen remodeling, new furniture, a swimming pool installation that probably cost more than many people's annual salaries. The picture that emerged was troubling. 2 adult children, living beyond their means, watching their father sit on a substantial portfolio while they accumulated debt and financial pressure. But I needed more information before drawing conclusions. Over the next 2 weeks, I began paying closer attention to our interactions. Rebecca called more frequently, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but her questions increasingly focused on my daily activities. Had I paid the bills on time? Was I remembering to take my medication? Had I spoken to my financial advisor recently? The medication question was particularly telling. I took a low-dose blood pressure medication prescribed after a routine checkup that showed slightly elevated readings, normal for a man my age dealing with grief and stress. But Rebecca made it sound like I was managing a complex medical regimen that required constant monitoring. Jason's approach was more direct. He began forwarding articles about senior financial abuse and cognitive decline warning signs, always with messages like, "Thought you should see this, Dad," or "This might be helpful to keep in mind." The articles were real, the concerns legitimate, but the implication was clear. They were preparing documentation for their narrative that I was becoming incapable of managing my own affairs. Then came the incident that confirmed my suspicions. I'd been having lunch with my old colleague and friend, Robert Chen, at the Greenwich Country Club. Robert had retired from financial planning the same year I had, and we'd maintained a friendship built on shared experiences and mutual respect for each other's judgment. We were discussing market volatility and investment strategies, the kind of technical conversation that kept our minds sharp, when Rebecca appeared at our table.
"Dad, there you are," she said, slightly breathless as if she'd been searching frantically. "You missed your appointment with Dr. Patterson." I'd had no appointment with Dr. Patterson. My next medical checkup wasn't scheduled for another month, and I'd confirmed that with his office just the week before. "Rebecca, I don't have an appointment today," I said calmly, though my heart rate was increasing as I realized what she was doing. "Yes, you do," she insisted, pulling out her phone with a theatrical gesture. "You called me yesterday, concerned because you couldn't remember if you'd confirmed it. We talked about how you'd been having memory issues, and I offered to help keep track of your appointments." Robert watched this performance with the kind of attention he'd once given to complex financial documents. His expression was neutral, but I could see him processing the exchange, noting the inconsistencies between Rebecca's story and the sharp, engaged conversation we'd been having about market analysis. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, standing from the table. "Robert, let's continue this conversation another time." But Rebecca wasn't finished. "Dad, this is exactly what we've been worried about. You seem confused about your schedule, and now you're getting upset about it." The word confused was delivered loudly enough for nearby diners to hear, along with upset, painting a picture of an elderly man having a public breakdown over a missed appointment that hadn't existed. I left the club with Rebecca, but not before seeing Robert's concerned expression and the curious glances from other members who'd witnessed what appeared to be a family managing an elderly relative's confusion. In the car, Rebecca continued her performance. "Dad, I'm really worried about these memory lapses. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with a specialist." "Rebecca," I said, keeping my voice level, "there was no appointment with Dr. Patterson." "Of course there was," she replied, her tone patient and condescending. "You called me about it yesterday. You were worried because you couldn't find it in your calendar." She was lying with such confidence that someone less experienced in detecting deception might have questioned their own memory. But I'd spent 40 decades helping people navigate financial decisions, which meant I'd learned to spot manipulation in all its forms. That evening, I began documenting everything. I opened a new file on my computer, password protected and backed up to a secure cloud service, and started recording every interaction with Rebecca and Jason that seemed designed to undermine my competence or confidence. The false appointment incident was the first entry, but I soon realized there had been other, more subtle attempts that I'd initially dismissed. 3 weeks earlier, Jason had called to ask if I'd received a payment from one of my investment accounts. When I confirmed that I had, he'd said, "Good, I was worried because you mentioned not being sure about your direct deposit schedule." I'd never mentioned any uncertainty about direct deposits. My investment income arrived like clockwork, and I tracked every payment in a spreadsheet I updated monthly. 2 weeks before that, Rebecca had arrived at my house with groceries I hadn't requested, claiming I'd called her to ask for help with shopping because I'd gotten confused at the store the previous week. I hadn't been to the grocery store that week, and I certainly hadn't called anyone for help. They were creating a fictional version of me, forgetful, confused, unable to manage daily tasks, and documenting each incident as evidence of my decline. But two could play at documentation. I began recording phone calls, legal in Connecticut as long as one party consents, and keeping detailed written records of every interaction with Rebecca and Jason. I also started asking specific questions designed to test their knowledge of my actual financial situation. "Jason,
"I've been thinking about adjusting my asset allocation," I said during one phone call. "What do you think about moving some money out of bonds and into REITs?" His answer was generic financial advice that could have come from any investment website, peppered with phrases like, "That's something we should discuss with your advisor," and "It depends on your risk tolerance." Jason had no idea what my current asset allocation was, what my risk tolerance had been for the past decade, or which specific investments made up my portfolio. He was talking about managing my money without understanding what money he'd be managing. Rebecca's knowledge was even more limited. When I mentioned considering a Roth IRA conversion, she responded with enthusiasm about maximizing tax advantages, apparently unaware that at my age and income level, a Roth conversion would likely create more tax liability than benefit. They wanted control of a $2.3 million portfolio without understanding the first thing about how it was structured, why it was structured that way, or what strategies had been used to build and preserve it over 40 decades.
But their lack of financial knowledge wasn't their biggest mistake. Their biggest mistake was underestimating their target. I'd spent my career helping families protect their wealth from all kinds of threats: market volatility, economic uncertainty, and yes, family members who saw inheritance as an early retirement plan. I'd seen every manipulation tactic, every sob story, every emergency that supposedly required immediate access to someone else's money. Rebecca and Jason's strategy was textbook financial elder abuse, executed with the kind of confidence that comes from believing their target is too old and confused to recognize what's happening. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. The confrontation came, predictably, during another family dinner. This time, they brought reinforcements: Marcus and Elena, plus Rebecca's teenage daughter, Sarah, my granddaughter, who looked uncomfortable but had clearly been coached about her role in this drama. "Dad, we need to talk about your situation," Jason began, his lawyer voice in full effect. "We've been discussing it as a family, and we all agree that you need help. All. As if my personal finances were a matter for family vote." "Sarah's been worried about you too," Rebecca added, nodding toward my granddaughter. "She mentioned that you seemed confused during her last visit." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding eye contact. Whatever she'd been told to say, she was clearly reluctant to participate in this intervention. "What specific confusion are you referring to?" I asked, directing the question to Sarah rather than Rebecca. Mom said you asked me the same question twice," Sarah mumbled, still not meeting my eyes. "Which question?" The silence stretched until Rebecca jumped in. "Dad, you don't need to interrogate Sarah. The point is that everyone's noticed changes in your behavior." "Everyone except me. And everyone except Robert Chen, who had lunch with me last week and commented on how sharp my analysis of market trends was. And everyone except Dr. Patterson, who saw me for my annual physical and noted no cognitive concerns. And everyone except my financial advisor, who meets with me quarterly and has never expressed any doubts about my mental acuity." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Thomas, sometimes the person experiencing cognitive changes is the last to recognize them. That's why family intervention is so important." "Intervention." I repeated the word slowly. "Is that what this is?" "We prefer to think of it as family support. Family support would be asking if I need help and accepting my answer. This feels more like a coordinated campaign to convince me I'm incompetent." Jason's composure cracked slightly. Dad, we're trying to help you before you make a serious mistake with your finances. What kind of mistake? Well, for instance, you could fall victim to a scam, or make impulsive investment decisions, or my adult children could convince me to give them control of my portfolio so they can fix their own financial problems. The statement landed like a grenade in the middle of the dining room. Elena's face went white. Marcus stopped mid-gesture, his water glass frozen halfway to his lips. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Jason recovered first, his lawyer training kicking in. Dad, that's a terrible thing to suggest. We're not trying to benefit financially from helping you. Then you won't mind signing a document stating that any financial management you provide will be done without compensation and with full transparency, including quarterly reports on all transactions. That's not the point, Rebecca said, her voice rising slightly. The point is that you need help and we're your family.
The point, I said, standing from my chair, is that you've spent months trying to gaslight me into believing I'm losing my mental faculties so you can gain control of my finances. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? I walked to my study and returned with a folder containing printed copies of everything I'd been documenting. Phone records, transcripts of recorded conversations, financial research on Rebecca and Jason's businesses, screenshots of their social media posts showing expensive purchases while claiming financial concern for their elderly father. Would you like to explain why Rebecca's consulting business filed for a tax extension while she was posting pictures of a $5,000 handbag on Instagram? I asked, spreading the documents on the table. Or why Jason's law firm lost the Morrison account 3 months ago while he was renovating his kitchen? The silence was deafening. Sarah looked confused and uncomfortable, clearly unaware of the adult drama she'd been pulled into. Marcus and Elena seemed to be calculating whether to continue the performance or cut their losses. Rebecca found her voice first. Dad, you've been spying on us? I've been protecting myself from what appears to be a coordinated attempt to manipulate me into giving up control of my finances. That's paranoid thinking, Jason said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Let me read you some quotes from recorded phone calls. I opened the folder and selected a transcript. Rebecca, 3 weeks ago. Dad seems really confused about his medication schedule. I'm worried he might take the wrong dosage. For the record, I take 1 blood pressure pill once a day, same time every day, and have never expressed any confusion about it. Rebecca's face flushed red. I was being careful. Jason, 2 weeks ago. I think Dad forgot about our lunch plans again. He's been having trouble with his calendar lately. For the record, we had no lunch plans, and you called to cancel plans that didn't exist. I continued reading from their own words, their own attempts to create a fictional narrative of my decline, while they sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Here's my favorite, I said, turning to a more recent transcript. Marcus, 5 days ago, talking to Rebecca on what you thought was a private call. We need to move faster on this. Thomas is sharper than we expected, and if he starts really investigating our finances, we're screwed. Marcus went pale. You recorded a private conversation between me and my wife? I recorded a conversation that took place in my house, on my phone, when you called my landline and Rebecca put you on speaker, not knowing I was in the next room. In Connecticut, that's perfectly legal. The performance was over.
The masks had fallen away, leaving behind the desperate financial pressure that had motivated this elaborate charade. "Look," Jason said, dropping the family concern act, "we do need help. Elena and I are facing some temporary cash flow issues, and you thought manipulating me into believing I was losing my mind was preferable to asking for a loan?" "We didn't think you'd understand," Rebecca said quietly. "Understand what? That you spent beyond your means and expected me to bail you out?" Elena spoke for the first time since my revelation. "It's not that simple, Thomas. We have obligations, commitments. You have a lifestyle you can't afford, and parents you thought you could manipulate into funding it." The conversation continued for another hour, with Rebecca and Jason alternating between defensive justifications and half-hearted apologies. They'd convinced themselves that their financial pressures justified their actions, that elderly parents existed primarily as safety nets for their adult children's mistakes. By the end of the evening, several things were clear. They had no remorse for the psychological manipulation they had attempted. They still believed they deserved access to my wealth simply by virtue of being my children, and they would almost certainly try again with different tactics. I walked them to the door with the same courtesy Catherine had always insisted we show guests, even unwelcome ones. But as Jason paused on the threshold, I had one final message.
"I want you both to understand something clearly," I said. "I've spent 40 years protecting people's wealth from predators. I'm very good at it. If you ever attempt to manipulate me again, if you ever spread lies about my mental capacity, if you ever try to gain unauthorized access to my finances, I will use every legal and financial tool at my disposal to protect myself. And those tools are considerable." Jason started to respond, but I wasn't finished. "I'll also be revising my estate planning to reflect what I've learned about your character. Actions have consequences, and the consequences of trying to defraud your own father are permanent." After they left, I sat in Catherine's chair at the head of the dining room table, something I hadn't done since her death. The chair that had always been hers felt strange, but somehow appropriate for what came next. I opened my laptop and began typing. The first email was to my estate planning attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss revisions to my will. The second was to my financial advisor, asking him to implement additional security measures on my accounts. The third was to Robert Chen, apologizing for the scene at the country club and explaining what had actually been happening. But the most important document I created that night was a detailed report of everything Rebecca and Jason had attempted, complete with dates, recorded conversations, and evidence of their financial motives. I called it a case study in family financial manipulation, and I sent copies to the Adult Protective Services Department, the State Attorney General's Office, and the American Bar Association's Ethics Committee. Rebecca and Jason had tried to convince me I was too old and confused to manage my own money. Instead, they'd demonstrated that they were too dishonest and desperate to be trusted with anyone else's. Over the following weeks, the consequences of their actions began to unfold. Rebecca's consulting business, already struggling, lost 2 major clients when word spread about her attempt to manipulate her elderly father. The business community in Greenwich is smaller and more interconnected than most people realize, and news travels fast among the circles where reputation matters. Jason faced a more serious problem. The Connecticut State Bar Association opened an ethics investigation based on my complaint, which documented his attempts to manipulate a potential client, me, through deception and fraud. Even though I wasn't technically his client,
The Bar Association took a dim view of lawyers who used their legal knowledge to exploit family members. Elena and Marcus found themselves dealing with the social consequences of their participation in the scheme. Greenwich society operates on networks of trust and reputation, and their names had become associated with elder abuse attempts. Marcus's real estate business suffered as clients questioned whether someone who would manipulate his wife's father could be trusted with their property transactions. But the most significant consequence was the permanent change in our family dynamic. Sarah, my granddaughter, reached out to me independently a month after the confrontation. She was 18, old enough to understand what really happened, and she was disgusted by her parents' behavior. "Grandpa, I need you to know that I never said you were confused," she told me during a lunch we arranged without her parents' knowledge. "Mom told me to say that, but I refused. I know you're not losing your mind. You're probably smarter than all of us combined." Sarah's support meant more to me than I could express. She'd been caught in the middle of an adult conflict she didn't create, and she'd chosen integrity over family loyalty. It was a choice Catherine would have been proud of. "Your parents love you, Sarah," I told her. "They made terrible decisions because they were desperate, but that doesn't mean they don't love you." "Maybe," she said, "but I don't respect them anymore, and I'm not going to pretend what they did was okay just because they're my parents." 6 months later, I received a call from a local television producer who'd heard about my case through social services contacts. They were working on a documentary about financial elder abuse, and they wanted to interview me about my experience. "Mr. Harrison, your case is unusual because you recognized and documented the manipulation in real time. Most victims don't realize what's happening until significant damage has been done." I agreed to participate, but only under conditions that protected my privacy while still allowing the story to serve as a warning to other elderly adults.
The documentary, titled Family Predators: When Adult Children Become the Threat, aired 9 months after my confrontation with Rebecca and Jason. My segment, filmed in shadow to protect my identity, included audio recordings of their manipulation attempts and expert commentary on the tactics they'd used. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of elderly viewers contacted the television station to report similar experiences with their own adult children. Many had been successfully manipulated into giving up financial control, only to watch their life savings disappear into their children's debt and lifestyle expenses. But the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source: other financial professionals who began using my case as a training example for their clients. "Thomas, your documentation has become a template for how to protect yourself from family financial manipulation," my former colleague Robert Chen told me during one of our monthly lunches. "I've had 3 clients this year who recognized similar patterns in their own families and took preventative action." The template I'd unintentionally created included warning signs to watch for, documentation methods that could provide legal protection, and strategies for confronting manipulation while preserving family relationships where possible. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. Elderly adults needed to trust their own judgment, even when family members suggested they couldn't. The hardest part of financial elder abuse, I explained during follow-up interviews, is that it comes from people you're supposed to trust. When your own children tell you you're losing your mind, your first instinct is to believe them. But competence doesn't disappear overnight, and financial expertise doesn't evaporate at age 65. 2 years after the confrontation, I received an unexpected letter from Rebecca. "Dad, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong we were. The therapy I've been attending helped me realize that we were so focused on our own financial stress that we convinced ourselves manipulating you was somehow justified. The letter continued for 3 pages, acknowledging the emotional damage they'd caused and expressing genuine remorse for their actions. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, which I appreciated. She simply wanted me to know that she understood the severity of what they attempted. Jason's letter arrived a week later, shorter, but equally genuine in its acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I betrayed everything you taught me about integrity. I used my legal knowledge to try to defraud my own father, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. Neither letter asked for money, which suggested their remorse might be genuine rather than strategic. But genuine remorse doesn't erase consequences.
I'd revise my will to reflect their demonstrated character. The bulk of my estate now goes to establish a foundation focused on protecting elderly adults from financial abuse, with Sarah as the primary beneficiary and eventual director. Rebecca and Jason would receive token amounts, enough to avoid legal challenges, but not enough to solve their financial problems. The money they'd tried so hard to access through manipulation would instead be used to help other elderly adults avoid the emotional trauma they'd inflicted on me. 3 years later, at age 71, I remain in complete control of my finances, my health, and my life decisions. My portfolio has grown to $2.8 million through careful management and conservative investments. My mind is as sharp as ever, perhaps sharpened by the experience of successfully defending myself against coordinated manipulation. Sarah graduated from college with honors and works part-time for the foundation while pursuing graduate studies in social work, specializing in elder care advocacy. She represents the best of what family relationships can be: loving, respectful, and free from manipulation. Rebecca and Jason have both stabilized their financial situations through hard work and reduced spending rather than elder abuse. We maintain minimal contact, birthday cards and holiday greetings, but the trust necessary for deeper relationships was permanently damaged by their actions.
The foundation I established, the Catherine Harrison Fund for Elder Protection, has helped hundreds of elderly adults recognize and resist financial manipulation attempts. We provide education, legal resources, and emotional support for elderly adults who find themselves targets of family predators. But the most important service we provide is validation. When elderly adults report that their families are trying to manipulate them, we believe them. We don't assume that age automatically equals incompetence or that family members always have good intentions. During speaking engagements, I often conclude with a simple message: trust your instincts. If something feels like manipulation, it probably is. Age and experience don't make you vulnerable. They make you valuable. And valuable things are worth protecting. My adult children convinced me I was too old to manage my own money, so they took control of my $2.3 million portfolio. What they didn't know was that I'm a retired financial advisor who had been secretly documenting their attempts to financially abuse me. They learned too late that some elderly adults fight back with 40 years of professional experience and the patience to let consequences unfold naturally. The money they tried so desperately to access is now helping other elderly adults protect themselves from family predators. Sometimes the best revenge is ensuring that your attacker's victims become someone else's protectors. Catherine would have been proud of the foundation that bears her name. She would have been less proud of the necessity for its existence, but she would have understood why protecting elderly adults from their own families had become my final career. At 71, I've learned that age doesn't automatically equal wisdom. But experience combined with vigilance can protect you from almost any threat, even when that threat comes from people you raised, educated, and loved. Rebecca and Jason thought they could manipulate an old man who'd forgotten how to protect himself. Instead, they discovered that some old men remember exactly how to fight back, and they have the resources to make the fight count. Trust your instincts, document everything, and never assume that family relationships provide immunity from predatory behavior. Some lessons cost $2.3 million to learn. Others cost relationships that can never be repaired. The choice of which lesson you learn depends on how well you protect yourself when the people who are supposed to love you decide they love your money more. My children thought they were targeting a confused old man. They were actually targeting a retired financial advisor with 40 years of experience protecting people from predators. The predators in this case just happened to be his own children.